Howdy folks, I'm recording the audio over the top of this video because while I was doing this job I had a pretty bad cold and I didn't think you'd wanted to hear me sniffling and sneezing throughout the process. So here goes. I'm verifying that everything's clean and free spinning, making sure the seal doesn't have any dirt in it, and there goes the cassette sliding back into the cases. I made sure that the gear position sensor was in the right place. The selector is still in the neutral position, and I'm just going to run the chain over the output shaft. It's just poking through at this point. It hasn't quite gone all the way through the seal, through the output shaft seal. The manual says to just give it a short, sharp whack with a mallet, so here goes. Just make sure it's all lined up, and pop, pop. Not quite all the way in, just a little bit of fiddling, and it'll go in. And then double check the sprocket output shaft, or the sprocket shaft, and it's moving through nicely. One more whack, there it goes. I could feel and hear it seated all the way, and everything rotates properly, so nothing's bound up. Everything is seated as it should be. So we should be good to go. So at this point, I'll get ready to run the bolts in. I'm going to double check the gear position sensor. It worked, but oops, got to put the selector in. I think that's called a pole, P-A-W-L. Yep, and it's able to rotate the drum properly. Nothing's binding. Let's turn on the gear position display on the dash. There it goes. So we're in neutral now, which is the position of the selector drum and the selector spring detent. So we're good. So we'll set the torque wrench where it should be. We'll run the bolts in with the electric driver first, just makes it quicker. There, you saw the cover just move in just a little bit extra. Yeah, I assume people don't necessarily want to see me install every single nut and bolt, so sometimes I do edit out a bit of the repetitive stuff, but there's not many of these, so I'll leave this in here. And again, using efficient techniques can actually make it pretty quick. So let's use a crisscross pattern. There's the torque wrench, giving it buzzes in your hand like a phone. It shakes when you get the right torque level, and it beeps, and it flashes a light. I guess if you're inside a giant engine in the dark and you can't see anything, you can't read the display, then it'll tell you. And if it's really loud, if you're working on a flight line with jet engines roaring around you and you can't hear anything, well, then you can still feel and see it. And if you're wearing gloves and you can't feel anything, then you can either see it or hear it. So it's got all the bases covered. It's a good item. But then again, I can justify the expense because I use it all the time, because it was not cheap, but it is very reliable. Okay, so double checking that everything's seated the way it should. Take a look and make sure that output shaft is where it should be, and it is. Okay, let's connect the shifter, but don't push the rod through because this one doesn't have a C-clip on this side of the motor like most Japanese bikes do, to prevent exactly that from happening. If I had a lathe, I'd probably cut a groove on there and install a spring ring C-clip, whatever you want to call it. Okay, there's checking the selector and the position sensor. It's working, so we don't need the ignition anymore. Keep the hands clean. And next up is the oil pump drive sprocket. Whatever you do, do not drop that pin into the sump. That would be a real pain. So seat the pin into the slot in the back of the sprocket and secure it with the C-clip, ring clip, whatever you want to call it. make sure it has seated properly, because the last thing you want to do is just push that onto the shaft and not into the slot. Then it'll come loose, and yeah, that'll make for a very emotional event. Very expensive one too. So I'm just running the clip through the groove to make sure it's seated properly and it's not got any dirt or anything underneath it that might, through some freak of physics, actually cause it to come loose. Okay, double checking that everything works. And next up is the clutch basket. Where is it? Yeah. Put the tools away so you can always get to them when you need them. So you don't have to hunt around. Okay, and there's a spacer in the back. Make sure it's in the right place, in the right orientation. If you always pull things off the way they came on and leave them positioned so that they can go back on easily, then you never have to worry about orienting pieces correctly. Now I've got to mate the basket driven gear and the oil pump drive gear with the crankshaft output gear. When they're all meshed up properly, the teeth will align axially so they have full seated area. And next up, the clutch with the slipper. Don't forget the shim. And the hub goes in. The slipper spring is there on my finger. Just making sure again that everything's clean. And that's the ramp style slipper that actually allows the clutch to freewheel if the rear tire is transmitting too much torque through the chain. And of course, the stiffer that spring is, the more resistance the slipper clutch will have to operating. There was a tiny hair. Don't know how that got in there. Looking for the right orientation. And you can see the slot machined in the clutch shaft. It's not really clear, but it's there. And you can also see the strange little ring on the inside of this nut. That thin section on the inside of the nut is supposed to be punched down into that slot. And that deformed metal prevents the nut from coming loose. And I've worked on a couple of Aprilia motors, of RSV4 motors, and none of them have had that slot punched in, or staked, as I've heard it called. So, if it's not required, then maybe I won't worry about it. If this was going to be a street bike that wasn't going to be opened again for 10,000 miles, I would do it. But I'm going to be working on this thing on a regular basis. So just run the nut down with the impact and then check the torque with the torque wrench. Make sure it's the right amount. I think it was 70 something. Can't remember exactly. Don't have the manual with me this time. So I know what it is. I'll just read the gauge as it gets set. So that's more than 12. It's 75. Okay, that's it. Release the holding tool. And yeah, I was strongly tempted to stake that nut. But I was thinking I'll check it again to make sure the clutch is okay. Little did I know that I would be checking it again a lot sooner than I expected. But more on that later. Okay. Next up is the clutch plates, the fibers, and the steels. Now, I've always been taught that the fibers should be oriented with the slot in the same groove. But when I pulled this clutch out, they were just randomly arranged. No rhyme or reason. So I'm looking for a reference point on the hub for the steels. I couldn't find one on the hub for the fibers. So, yeah, I guess if the factory doesn't do it, then there's probably a reason. Maybe. And the steels are punched out of a flat sheet, so as a result there's a rounded surface, a rounded edge, and a sharp edge. And in this particular case, the sharp edge faced out, and there is the spring used for the slipper. That fiber plate has a much larger inside diameter to clear that spring. So the slot's oriented and the sharp edge is out on all the steels, and it may not make much difference if that slot is not oriented correctly or uniformly, but yeah, I like to do things like that. And it probably wouldn't make a lot of difference if those sharp and rounded edges were not all uniform, but again, if you can make something repeatable and oriented the same way, why not? It just looks better. So I'm double checking, make sure there's no uneven wear, make sure there's no bold patches on these fiber plates, which can happen. I've seen that where there was just it looked like a tire that was worn unevenly. And a bunch of these little pads on the fiber plates were just rubbed down to nothing. Time for a new clutch. A new clutch pack, I should say. Quite often you order a new clutch and it just comes with the fibers. That's the cheapest way, because of course the fibers wear out long before the steels. Okay, just last one, and then the cam plate, they call this, and just as I was installing it, I felt a little something under my finger. So while I was seating it, I thought, I could feel something grinding. But where is that? And then I saw this tiny, tiny little bit of grit in that aluminum, and it came out in my fingernail. And it left a tiny little hole, just tiny. Hard to believe that something like that could actually pass through the filter. So maybe it was loose in the motor and never flowed through the filter. But anyway, no serious damage. On goes the cam plate, meets up with the teeth in the interior. And next up is the springs. We'll just, don't forget the spring. There we go. And again, we'll use a crisscross pattern. Do one, and then the opposite. And we're starting with a lower torque setting. I think that's the lowest torque setting this driver can be set to. And I'll torque them properly when they're all in, again in a crisscross pattern. I mentioned in another video that even though we can't see it or feel it, metal is elastic. It will bend if you put enough force onto it. And sometimes a bolt that's done to 20, 30, 40 or more foot-pounds, pound-feet I should say, can actually be exerting a much greater force in the thousands of psi thanks to the ramp action of the threads in the bolts. And even though you may not realize it, you're exerting a lot of force on a piece of metal that may deform at only 10,000 psi, but that bolt at 50 foot-pounds could exert twice that. So if you tighten all the bolts on one side to the full torque and do so unevenly, then it's very possible to actually deform that piece of metal. And it might not be deformed by much, but the tolerances in these engines are small, very small. And over tightening one side of a cylinder or a cylinder head or clutch, anything like that, and you'll really feel the difference. If there's a few thousandths of deformation in a clutch hub or a cam plate like this, it won't exert even pressure on the plates. Maybe that's how those plates that I checked, those fiber plates, were unevenly worn. So it's always a good idea to increase torque gradually and evenly. Okay, so there goes the gasket. I'll put it on the surface. I'm not going to use silicone sealant yet because, like I said several times already, this engine gets torn down on a regular basis. If it leaks, then I probably will pull it and put a little silicone around the bottom surface. But whatever I do, I don't want to put so much silicone on this to cause a bead of it to form on the inside of the engine and then break off and start flowing through the oil circulation system. I had that happen once on a rebuilt KTM that I bought, and then when I was pulling it apart for some maintenance and a rebuild, I was amazed to find that some of the jets that were supposed to be squirting oil onto the transmission gears were blocked. I couldn't believe that the transmission lasted as long as it had, with 50% of its lubrication stopped up. And it was all because of this great long strand of silicone from when the previous builder assembled it. And they just used too much silicone. So sure, it didn't leak, but it almost imploded. It would have been a major problem if that gearbox had had all of its oil supply cut off. It certainly wouldn't have lasted very long if that had happened. So I'm very conscious of not putting excess silicone on any of the mating surfaces. I'd rather put on too little and then watch and then seal up any leaks than put on too much and wonder why something just went crunch. Okay, so we've got to make sure that the clutch actuator there is oriented correctly. Just got to twist it the right way and then mate up with the starter idler gear. And once you can feel them seated or mated, then you can seat them with a quick little whack. Okay, I don't think you need to see me installing every single one of these bolts, so I'll just show the process for one. And again, as always, I'm going to clean it. So I get a relatively clean rag, run the bolt backwards. There, you can see some black gunk that came off the threads. It just gets everywhere. You don't want to put it back into the case, into the threads. Okay, so I've done the same thing, cleaned each one, installed it into the correct bolt hole, and then torqued it up. I think the actual torque listed in the manual for these was 12, but that seemed to me like it was too much. So I set them to 9 because I know these are very easy to strip. And I would rather have them a little lower and make sure that none of them strip than set the wrench to 12 and accidentally go over and then feel the aluminum threads in the engine crankcases start to pull out. That is an unpleasant feeling. Although I've got a lot of experience with helicoils. I've got a huge supply left over from doing antique, or should I say, classic race bikes. I spoke to a mechanic whose job it was to build race bikes back in the 80s and 90s and said, how come there are so many stripped threads in this bike? And he says, well, we never really had time to use a torque wrench. Okay, so let's put the clutch actuator arm after we position the sensor. That's the crankshaft position sensor. It reads that reluctor wheel through a Hall effect sensor. So every time that little tab of metal passes through the magnetic field that's generated by that sensor, it changes the, I guess it's the resistance factor or value, or maybe it just picks up EMF. And so that way the computer knows exactly where the crankshaft is rotationally. So let's put the the actuator arm into position. The best place for this is so that when you're easing the clutch out and reaching the friction zone, this arm needs to be at 90 degrees to the cable. That'll give you the most linear feel. Which is to say the least clutch travel for any given hand motion. The further this arm is from 90 degrees when you reach the friction zone, the more difficult it is to feel precisely where that friction zone is. Doesn't make a huge amount of difference, but it's the sort of thing where you notice when you're riding a bike that's not set up well. Little things like that all add up. Okay, let's just pull that spring into position. Give it a little wiggle. As long as there's not a bolt in there, it'll pop down any second now. And there we go. So at the moment it's a little over 90 degrees, but that means that when I pull it to actuate the clutch, it'll be as close to 90 degrees as I can get it. But that'll take a little fine tuning. I probably won't show that on this video. That's the sort of thing that's, it's easy to do, to set up for personal preference. Make sure the threads are clean. It's always good to be able to thread a bolt all the way down by hand with your fingers, that is. So that way you can feel if there's any resistance, if there's any dirt in there. If you don't clean the threads on a regular basis, after a while, they just get full of dirt. They pick up dust. Even just tiny little amounts of dust can accumulate. So make sure the wrenches are clean. Make sure the hands are clean. And I probably should have checked the lever before I tightened this up, but I'll be doing that any minute now. Not too tight, but just tight enough. And again, clean all the dirt out. I made sure to do this as carefully as I could before I pulled the cover, because the worst thing in the world, oh my god, if you pull a cover like this off when it's caked in dirt, like on a tractor or a truck or a dirt bike, and then you watch a big chunk of dirt fall into the engine, oh, that's awful. You just know that that's going to cause problems. So you clean it before you strip it down, clean it while you're stripping it down and then rebuilding, and clean it down after you're done. It can make a huge difference to the life of a motor. It'll make the engine last longer, it'll run better, it'll be more reliable, it'll just perform better in every way if it's as clean as you can possibly get it. So I'm just cleaning dirt anywhere I see it. I've got to use the right Allen. And this again was a very low torque setting, but it's really not that critical to use a torque wrench on something like that, especially when you can see it just by taking a gander. Okay, the gear shift is in the right position, so I'll run this bolt through. And I haven't put the sprocket in yet because I need to actually loosen the rear axle, move the wheel forward to put the sprocket onto the shaft. So I actually didn't show that on this video, but yeah, let's check the gear position sensor. It works. Put the oil back in. Checking the level while I'm pouring. And just about there. That's some E&I 5W40. Put the cap back on. I have to reinstall the safety wire for that. And I think we're just about ready to start her up. Double checking the gear position sensor. And this is where things took a turn for the surreal. Oh my god.